The shelves are restless tonight, not with noise. Shelves rarely dignify us with so simple a complaint. I mean a subtler agitation, the sort that arrives when old vellum has spent the day remembering weather it no longer receives. Dust has shifted on the upper ledges. A bronze clasp on a dead folio has gone a little green with memory. Even the candles, those faithful tyrants of the hidden stacks beneath Waterdeep, seem to be burning taller than necessary, as though they suspect that before dawn we shall be speaking of a people who tried to improve upon the horizon. There are histories that sit quietly when shut, and there are histories that continue levitating in the mind long after the page is closed. Tonight, we disturb one of the second kind. Somewhere above us in the city proper, a cartwheel has struck a rut badly enough to produce a long profanity from a teamster who believes the street exists solely to inconvenience him. Somewhere farther uphill, a young apprentice is probably being told that the proper use of magic is restraint, a lesson usually delivered by someone who has already committed all the expensive mistakes and would prefer no competition in the matter. And somewhere beyond the walls and beyond the age of this city entire, the bones of Netheril still lie scattered across desert and mountain, still persuading the foolish that altitude was wisdom. You have found your way again to the Lich's tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Belnorn, law warden, custodian of old continuities, and a stubborn enemy of the charming lie. You know the one, the lie that power becomes admirable if it is sufficiently grand. The lie that an empire's wonders can be separated neatly from the habits that paid for them. The lie that if a civilization leaves behind artifacts bright enough to tempt tomb robbers, then history ought to forgive the social arrangement that produced them. I do not forgive so cheaply. Archives are less sentimental than ruins. Last time we went east into purple dust. We followed Imaskar from fertile abundance to transworld theft. We watched artificers make distance obedient, labor fungible, prayer administratively inconvenient. We stood among the wreck of a realm that treated magic as imperial logistics and discovered that in Faerûn such crimes rarely remain merely political. When a state steals whole peoples and tries to wall the gods out at the border, the bill tends to arrive in geography. D. Tonight we turn north and west to another human answer to the same old temptation. Not the answer of stolen labor. Not at first. The answer of convenience, of abundance, of the astonishing danger that blooms when a people cease to treat magic as an occasional miracle and begin using it as a civic assumption. Tonight we speak of Netheril, of fishing villages beside the narrow sea, of elves who taught enough magic to alter a species' ambitions and then watched with the mounting irritation of the wise as the pupils mistook acceleration for maturity. Of the Nether Scrolls, ancient even then, and the dreadful effect of handing humanity a deeper grammar for reality before humanity had decided what sort of sentences it wished to speak. Of cantras in the hands of candlemakers and sweepers. Of arcanists as a ruling culture rather than a rare profession. Of Eulium, who asked how magic might sustain a civilization and answered with systems grand enough to reshape society. Of Mythalers, those blazing civic hearts that made wonder cheap, constant, and therefore culturally transformative, of enclaves, of laws written above the clouds, of what happens when a city ceases to sit upon the world and begins instead to hang over it like a conclusion. And of Karsus, who took everything Netheril admired about itself and drove it toward the sort of purity from which societies seldom recover. That is our matter tonight. Netheril matters because it made magic infrastructural. Many peoples in Faerûn have mastered spells. That alone is not unusual. Elves did so with grace long before humans were coherent enough to be dangerous at scale. Dwarves folded wonder into craft and duty with the grave practicality of a people who understand maintenance better than applause. Imaskar, as we saw, made magic administrative. Netheril did something both more seductive and in some ways more ruinous. It normalized arcane force so thoroughly that daily life itself changed shape around it. Light, water, transport, architecture, status, childhood education, trade, class, law, urban design. Even the simple human imagination of what counted as ordinary comfort. All of it bent around magical availability. A mythala is not only a device, it is a political fact. A floating city is not only a feat, it is a social argument. And once a civilization begins making those arguments in stone, spell, and habit, every later decision grows more dangerous. Before we lift anything larger than prudence, a word from the mortal practitioners of modern structure who, to their everlasting credit, solve scaling problems without dropping aristocracies on the countryside. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, builders of websites, systems, and technical frameworks that have the rare decency to remain legible after the first enthusiastic promise has met real use. If you need clean implementation, thoughtful architecture, or maintenance performed by people who understand that stability is not a glamorous afterthought but part of the craft itself, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. They build what a sensible archwizard would have built, had sensible archwizards ever controlled the genre for more than a fortnight. Now then, settle in. If the candlelight seems a little brighter than before, do not be alarmed. We are speaking tonight of a people who taught even their servants to borrow fire from the fabric of the world. And once you have invited Netheril into a room, the room is rarely content to remain a room. Let us begin with a correction, because Netheril is one of those names that later ages here through the static of catastrophe. When most people say Netheril, they do not picture fertile land. They picture an auroch, sand, buried archways, black glass fragments, blue fire rumors, the occasional upright tower still trying to look superior while half submerged in its own epitaph. All of that belongs to the afterlife of the realm. It is not where the story starts. Netheril rose beside the narrow sea. There were rivers, marshes, fishing villages, grazing land, traffic moving by boat and cart, wind over water rather than over dunes. This matters because civilizations born amid plenty develop a different rhythm of arrogance than civilizations forged under immediate scarcity. A people who must scrape survival from reluctant stone often become conservative in their habits of risk. A people who rise beside navigable water, fed by trade and broadening opportunity, are more likely to confuse expansion with destiny. The earliest Netherese were not yet the Skylords of later disgusted elven commentary. They were village folk, humans still organizing themselves into something more durable than kin clusters and raiding bands. Seventon, that name so easy to hurry past, matters immensely. 7 villages, 7 communities learning, by slow increments, that proximity can become polity. The beginning is humbler than the ruins suggest, as beginnings usually are. No shining enclave, no arch-wizard, no mountain sheared flat and turned into a municipal vanity, just the long work of gathering. There is something almost touching in that, if one is in a generous mood. I am not often in a generous mood where Netheril is concerned. Still, honesty obliges us. The people were not born monstrous. They were merely human, which has always been near enough when given time. By early tradition, the first decades of Netheril's history were marked less by wizardry than by survival, local leadership, and encounters with neighboring powers older and subtler than themselves. The elves of Erlan were among the first of those neighbors to matter decisively. That relationship deserves care. Lazy tellings reduce it to a simple gift story. Noble elves teach crude humans magic, humans become ungrateful, and the world suffers. There is some truth in outline and very little in texture. Cultural transfer is never so clean. The elves traded. The Netherese learned eagerly. Human ambition did the rest. One name survives near the beginning with unusual clarity. Faerûn Lorecast, remembered as the first Netherese arcanist. The old annals say he studied cantras from the elves for a year and then kindled a campfire by spell. It sounds almost childish beside what follows. It is not. A campfire started by learned magic is one thing when performed by a rare holy specialist. It is quite another when it marks the beginning of a social habit. For Netheril did not treat spellcraft as the guarded preserve of a priestly caste or a few blood-marked prodigies. It moved in another direction almost at once. That direction was diffusion. For the next century, magic use in the little nation grew in leaps and bounds, and unlike many other cultures of the realms, Netheril regarded basic magical literacy as essential. Everyone who reached the age of ascension, 13 summers, was taught the ways of simple spellcraft. Not enough to become an arch-wizard, not enough to shear mountains, enough to alter expectations. Parents taught children cantras, instructors refined them, workplaces integrated them, candle makers, sweepers, craftsmen, servants. Ordinary people handled low-level magic as part of useful life. Do not rush past that. It is the first great Netherese revolution. Not the discovery of the scrolls, not the first Mythalar, not the first floating city. Those come later and receive all the paintings. The deeper transformation begins here when a civilization decides that arcane literacy belongs not only to specialists but to society. Even a weak spell, repeated through thousands of households, changes what a people consider normal. If dirt can be cleaned with a cantra, labor changes. If water may be warmed, or a small flame coaxed into being by rote magical practice, domestic life changes. If work training includes spell tricks suited to your trade, craft itself changes. Childhood changes too. What does it do to a people when adolescence includes initiation, not merely into tools and custom, but into the conviction that reality will answer, however slightly, to practiced will. It makes them impatient with limits. That is not the only result, but it is the one history eventually builds them for. In this early period, the Netherese did not yet stand alone. The elves of Airlan remained both ally and example. Dwarven powers, especially Delzun and its lines of trade through Asgore, would also matter greatly. Orc threats pressed from surrounding wilds. The Rengarth and Angard, the great human barbarian peoples of the northern spaces, stood nearby as kin in blood and strangers in social development. Netheril was one human answer among several. What made it different was not merely ambition. Other peoples had ambition in quantities ample enough to fill libraries with funerary song. What made Netheril different was that it married early social adoption of magic to a human scale of reproduction, competition, and desire. Humans change fast. Teach them a tool that alters the environment, and they do not merely use it. They reorganize around it. By the 3rd century of Netherese reckoning, that reorganization received a terrible accelerant. In the year the old sources call 326, about minus 3533 DR by later calendars, a figure remembered only as Finder discovered the Nether Scrolls west of the Far Horns forest, in an ancient ruined structure whose furnishings suggested makers not human and perhaps not even bipedal in the ordinary sense. That detail matters. The scrolls were already relics when found. Netheril did not invent this knowledge. It inherited it from a deeper archaeology of power. Later traditions, drawing on wider realms lore unavailable to the early Netherese, attach the scrolls to an immensely ancient chain of magical scholarship reaching back through the Baetith and perhaps to creator race hands, far older than elf or man. The records differ in decorative certainty, and I will not sharpen speculation into false granite. It is enough to say that the Nether Scrolls were ancient, non-human in origin, and so dense with magical insight that their discovery altered the trajectory of a civilization. Finder found 100 golden leaves, 2 sets of 50. One appeared older than the other. He brought them home. He studied them. He shared the knowledge, and within a few decades, Netheril had experienced what may be called, without exaggeration, an epistemic detonation. Consider the significance. The elves had taught cantras and the rudiments of spellcraft. That is tutelage. The Nether Scrolls offered something else, systematized depth, not merely how to perform a trick or discipline a will, but how the larger architecture of arcane possibility might be understood, extended, and exploited. Spellcraft leaped, theory deepened, item creation advanced. Constructs, planar thought, artifact logic, manipulation of magical principles once beyond the reach of a young human realm. All of it quickened. A society already predisposed to distribute basic magic among its people had now acquired a body of law capable of turning its elite into something much worse than competent. This is where one must be careful with admiration. The discovery was extraordinary. It truly was. Any serious scholar of Faerûn who pretends otherwise is trying to purchase moral superiority on borrowed ignorance. The Netherese did not merely become gaudier after the scrolls, they became intellectually formidable. They entered an age of learning whose effects would be felt millennia later. The spell traditions they developed, the items they made, the theories they refined, the very idea of a human magocracy at continental consequence. None of this is separable from the scroll's arrival. But grandeur of effect is not innocence of use. The Nether Scrolls did not make Netheril corrupt by themselves. Knowledge rarely behaves so simply. They did, however, widen the gap between what the Netherese could imagine doing and what they had yet learned not to do. That gap is where high civilizations become hazardous. The scrolls also did something subtler and perhaps more enduring. They changed Netherese self-understanding. Before them, Netheril was a promising human realm, aided by elves, improving rapidly, still recognizably one nation among others. After them, the Netherese increasingly regarded themselves as participants in a larger arcane destiny. Their best minds did not simply want to cast better spells than yesterday. They wanted to discover principles, to systematize, to outstrip teachers, to prove quietly at first, and then with less modesty, that humanity need not remain the apprentice species. There is vigor in that impulse. There is also danger. For once, a civilization stops asking whether it may join the company of the great and starts asking how soon it may surpass them. Prudence becomes terribly vulnerable to ridicule. The old rivalries of the region sharpened under this new confidence. Orcs remained enemies. Trade with dwarves deepened. Relations with the elves became more complicated. The Erlani had shown the Netherese the door to magic. The Netherese now intended to remodel the house. Elven attitudes hardened from instructive patience to uneasy appraisal. The source material is quite plain. On one point, the elves never entirely stopped repeating. In their judgment, the Netherese used magic carelessly. Not casually exactly. The Netherese cared about magic very much, but they treated it as a power to manipulate, to harness, to press into increasingly public service, rather than an art to be shaped in cautious harmony with wider balances. The elven criticism was not entirely fair, which is to say, it was infuriatingly fair in the important places and smug almost everywhere else. For the Netherese were not simply flinging power about like children with bright coals. They were studying, refining, building theories and schools. The realm began producing arcanists of distinct disciplines, inventors, mentalists, variators, practical specialists. The scholarly infrastructure thickened around the magic already diffusing through common life. What had been a village nation of magically literate humans was becoming a civilization ruled by those who could go farther into the weave than their neighbors. The distinction between common spell user and arcanist widened, not into separate species, but into class. That is another foundational Netherese transformation. Because when everyone in a society knows a little magic, but some know much more, the elite do not merely appear powerful. They appear like the perfected form of what every child already touches in miniature. The archwizard becomes not an alien figure, but the cultural completion of an ideal society has already praised. You too learned cantras at 13, says Netheril to the commoner. Behold then the man or woman who did not stop. It is a terribly efficient ideology, and from it flows the whole later world of Netherese arcanist culture. Rivalry, schools, prestige, civic dependency on magical expertise, and the increasingly dangerous belief that the realm's health and the arcanist's ambitions are one and the same. That belief would eventually raise mountains. First, it had to raise expectations. By now, the people of Netheril had accepted several propositions that many other cultures would find disorienting. Basic arcane practice belonged in ordinary life. Magical theory could be pursued systematically and socially. The greatest prestige belonged to those who best manipulated the weave. The nation's future was bound to magical advancement. And older peoples, though respected in certain domains, need not be obeyed as limits on human possibility. You can see, can you not, the shape of what is coming? All that remains is infrastructure, not merely knowledge, not merely talent. A means by which magic can stop being a craft performed by gifted persons and become a stable condition surrounding them. That means would come through one of the greatest and most unsettling figures in all the annals of human Faerûn. It would come through Eolaum. Eolaum is one of those names that later ages cannot mention without either reverence or indigestion. The reverence is easy enough to understand. He trained thousands of arcanists. He shaped Netheril's spellcraft for generations. He created the Mythala, the single invention without which Netheril, as most people imagine it, does not exist. Even among a people pathologically devoted to making themselves difficult to overlook, he stood out. The indigestion comes from having to admit what sort of greatness he embodied. Eolaum was not a moral corrective to Netheril's arrogance. He was its most competent architect. That distinction matters. Too many histories, especially those written for younger students or older priests, look for one admirable elder within every doomed empire, a wise figure who almost steered the realm rightly until vanity ruined it. Netheril does not reward that simplification. Eolaum was brilliant, visionary, disciplined compared to many who followed, and indispensable to the rise of the realm. He was also perfectly capable of mass slaughter, imperial thinking, and the sort of civilization-scale intervention that leaves later generations praising the builder while trying not to inspect the foundations too closely. Consider his campaigns against the orcs. Before he was remembered as father of Netheril in the full grandiose sense, Eolaum had already demonstrated what large-scale magical organization could do to a military problem. He led tremendous campaigns against orc hordes threatening the realm. One of the most infamous, remembered in old materials as an excursion into extinction, used magical gates to move forces instantly through the hills and block escape routes, while tens of thousands of warriors and spellcasters scoured entire regions clean. The death toll among the orcs was appalling. So too was the cost in Netheril's lives. Bonehill and Thunderpeak, names that outlived the campaign, were not chosen for their lyrical modesty. Do not tidy this into simple necessity. Orcs were indeed a grave danger. Netheril and neighboring peoples had suffered from raids, predation, and war. A state has duties of defense, all true. But note what Eolaum's method reveals. He did not merely defeat a threat. He coordinated magical systems, troop movement, and strategic sealing of terrain at a scale that prefigured the later Enclave mentality. The Orc War showed him, and Netheril what planned arcane superiority could do when applied to logistics rather than isolated heroics. It taught the realm that magical infrastructure wins history. That lesson is the real preface to the Mithala. Ulaum was born in the 6th century of Netheril's reckoning, around -3315 DR in later calendars. And by the standards of human history that followed, he became almost obscenely productive. Thousands of arcanists passed through his influence. This is not some ornamental claim repeated by admirers in need of a patriarch. The source tradition really does present him as a teacher on vast scale, a central node in the intellectual and practical maturation of Netheril's arcana. To train one prodigy is notable. To train generations of the arcanist class is civilizational. This again separates him from Karsus long before we properly compare them. Karsus will embody intensity. Ulaum embodies systems. He did not only seek to outshine peers, he produced peers, rivals, successors, and imitators enough to reshape a nation. Then, in the year 845 of Netheril's reckoning, about -3014 DR, he created the Mithala. Here we must pause, breathe, and be precise, because a great many later adventurers, dramatists, and incompetent nobles confuse Mithala with Mythol. The two are not the same thing, though both concern the large shaping of magic. A mythal, in broad terms, is an immense and intricate field of high magic, most famously associated with elven works and city enchantments of staggering subtlety. A Mithala is a different beast altogether, a concentrated arcane engine, a civic heart, a blazing sphere of magical conversion and distribution. If a mythal is akin to a total environmental enchantment woven into place and pattern, a Mithala is closer to a power source married to an operating system. Netheril, you see, preferred its wonders in reproducible forms. The sources describe a Mithala as a crystal sphere-like device, roughly 150 feet in diameter, set upon an ornate stand, radiating a brightness nearly as harsh as looking at the sun. That physical image matters, but it is the function that remade history. A Mithala drew raw magic from the weave of Mistral and distributed that power through an enclave so that quasi-magical items could operate continuously within its radius. It also kept the floating city aloft. Touch it, and you died. Place most items against it, and they were annihilated. Powerful, lethal, central, and indispensable. It was an almost indecently accurate symbol of the society it sustained. I want you to feel what changed with this invention. Before the Mithala, permanent magical item creation cost mages dearly. The old records describe arcanists who made multiple permanent items as visibly aged and bent beyond their years. Vitality was the price of permanence. Magic could be done, certainly. Wonders existed. But each lasting enchantment carried a bodily and personal cost that naturally limited scale. Ulaum's device did not remove the need for intelligence, skill, or labor. It removed a bottleneck. By tapping raw magic from Mistral's weave and feeding quasi-magical operation over a broad area, the Mithala allowed arcanists to create an entirely new category of item. Things that behaved like permanent enchantments, so long as they remained within the Mithala's 1-mile sphere of influence. Read that again in civilizational terms. The problem of durable magical convenience had been partially solved. Once this happened, Netheril moved from magical competence to magical economy. The first Mythala-powered item followed quickly, only a few years later. Then came the flood. Prices of quasi-magical items dropped. The social spread of magical utility accelerated. Low and mid-level arcanists suddenly had a path to wealth through invention aimed not at gods or kings, but at the broad middle ranks of society. And because Netherese society already expected ordinary people to know some cantras and live near magic, these new objects did not appear alien. They appeared useful. There is nothing more dangerous than usefulness at scale. It arrives without needing to be worshipped. The first widely marketable items were not world-shaking instruments of doom. They were conveniences, room lights, simple globes shedding steady illumination, then refined into lights activated by sound or command, running water, achieved by permanent fissures to the elemental plane of water and controlled by mundane-seeming spigots. Once that existed, indoor plumbing and water closets followed. Storage devices, domestic aids, trade tools, minor luxuries, small optimizations. The sort of things no empire ever suspects are changing its soul because they appear to be changing only the kitchen, the corridor, the account book, or the washroom. But daily life is where civilizations truly happen. When every house on an enclave acquires room lights, darkness changes meaning. When water may be drawn through stable magical means indoors, urban hygiene, household labor, architecture, and expectation all change. When low-level arcanists begin seeking fortunes not by discovering one grand wonder, but by making a nicety look indispensable, consumer society appears in arcane dress. The source material says it with admirable bluntness. Their mentality was to make an item cheap, simple to use, and apparently invaluable, to turn a nicety into a necessity. There it is. Netheril did not merely discover magical infrastructure. It discovered magical market formation, and therefore the rise of the Mythala is not only a story about flying cities to come, it is about the moment arcane force enters the bloodstream of ordinary convenience. A people who can live with room lights in every chamber and running water in every home become a people less tolerant of darkness, distance, dirt, delay, manual effort, or anything else once shrugged off as the common conditions of mortal life. Luxury becomes baseline with astonishing speed. Those born after the change call it normal. Those who live outside it call it decadence. Both are right. This is one reason Netheril fascinates later ages so deeply. It was not only full of mighty mages, it was full of infrastructure envy. The dream was not simply, what if I were a great wizard? It was, what if the city itself worked as though wizardry had become masonry, aqueduct, marketplace, and civic custom? That dream has ruined better people than the Netherese. Now, we should say a word about the theological dimension, because episode 16 will demand it, and because Netheril was not yet the complete parody of self-idolatry later generations prefer to remember. The goddess of magic in those days was Mistril, not Mistra, and Netherese. Religious life had its own texture. Priestly magic was spoken of as the winds of the gods. Temples existed, belief persisted. Most archwizards, however, viewed deities with a confidence bordering on impiety. Many believed the gods to be merely beings of greater power, not fundamentally beyond challenge. There was already in Netheril a tendency to regard divinity less as sovereign transcendence than as a comparative category of magical status. A society that thinks that way, while also building mythalars, is already asking for a future lesson. And yet the record preserves one graceful complication. Among all the floating cities that would later drift above Netheril, only Eulaeum's enclave allowed a temple to Mistril upon it, the temple of all mysteries, singular among the enclaves. I do not exaggerate this into humility. It was not. But it does suggest that Eulaeum, for all his arrogance, did not entirely believe civilization could sever itself from the divine source of magic and prosper indefinitely. He remained a member of that religious community without becoming one of its clergy. The arrangement suits him perfectly in memory, close enough to the sacred to acknowledge dependence, far enough to remain master of the civic machine. You may admire the balance if you like. I call it honest, which is rarer and worth more. The important point is this. Eulaeum's philosophy of power was not anti-magic, anti-society, or anti-pleasure. It was integrative. He saw that magic could hold a city together, enrich common life, create new classes of goods, train generations, secure the realm, and elevate the prestige of Netheril over neighbors. He was not chasing only the exceptional spell. He was building conditions under which exceptional spells and ordinary comforts could coexist inside the same political order. That is why he matters so much. A prodigy can astonish. A system builder can transform an age. And with the mythalar in place, Netheril was now ready to commit its most famous act of self-definition. It was ready to leave the ground. Sources quarrel over the exact date of the first enclave's ascent, as old chronologies sometimes do when confronted with events too proud not to be remembered and too grand not to be recollected badly. Some reckonings place the first floating city in the mid-3rd millennium before Dela Reckoning. Older Netherese accounts place the achievement earlier by their own internal count. What matters is not the argument of calendars, but the agreement beneath it. Eulaeum raised the first floating city. Later tradition remembers it as Shinlenal, or simply the enclave of Eulaeum. It was the prototype, the proof, the insult to gravity from which all later Netherese social extravagance took permission. There are feats that alter military balance, there are feats that alter economics, and then there are feats that alter metaphor. A floating city changes how a people imagine rule. Do not reduce the enclave to transportation. It was not a ship. It was not even merely an airborne fortress. A floating city is an answer to a civilizational question. Where should power reside if magic makes place negotiable? The ordinary city binds ruler and rule to soil roads surrounding fields, nearby rivers, and the patience of walls. A floating city loosens every one of those bindings. It can relocate seasonally. It can hover where climate pleases. It can overawe without immediately occupying. It can withdraw from unrest below and arrive above resources needed next month. It can make the countryside serve while no longer sharing many of its vulnerabilities. A ruler on the ground may still claim transcendence. A ruler in the sky no longer needs to pretend. That is why the enclave is such a potent social device. It literalizes hierarchy, high and low stop being metaphors. High Netheril and low Netheril become not only administrative distinctions, but lived categories of altitude, access, and esteem. Some citizens are fortunate enough, as the sources put it with maddening cheer, to live in the clouds. Others remain below in ground-based cities, ports, farms, workshops, and market centers. The realm does not cease to require them. Far from it. But the visible geography of prestige has changed. Rule now hovers. Imagine the child born on an enclave. The sky is not the unreachable vault of weather and birds. It is municipal space. Roads are bridges of force. Windows look down on mountain crests from the wrong side of expectation. To travel is sometimes to relocate an entire district. To be educated is to be told in stone and spell that your civilization has improved upon the old insult of falling. Such a child will think differently about the people below, even if no tutor ever uses the word inferior. Architecture teaches before ideology finishes the sentence. And imagine the child below. You till, load, fish, herd, mine, bargain, or serve under a city that can pass above you like an opinion too wealthy to descend. Sometimes it is beneficent. Sometimes it buys your goods, protects trade, or flashes Mythala-powered signs of order against orc raids and monster incursions. Sometimes it arrives to take lumber, fish, ore, or taxes with the casual urgency of people who have forgotten what roads cost. Whether you admire or resent it, you live beneath a permanent demonstration that some citizens have literally risen out of the common condition. This does things to a polity. It breeds aspiration, resentment, imitation, and ideological numbness in different mixtures depending upon one's height. The sources are rich in examples if one reads them against their own complacency. Enclaves became mobile city-states ruled by arch-wizards whose word held law within their chosen airborne domains. Each arch-wizard established unique guidelines, regulations, social expectations, and architectural identities for the city he or she raised. The enclave was both municipality and ego made civic. One city organized itself in concentric rings with the arch-wizard at the center and the common populace pushed outward to the margins. Another became a haven of colleges and theatrical display. Another drifted seasonally to pursue resources or agreeable climates. Another went rogue and used its elevation to counterfeit coinage beyond easy reprisal. Another devoted itself to fish capture by using Mythala-linked systems to teleport sea life into prepared chambers. One experimented with its Mythala until its citizens became giants. One spent years in reconstruction because magic had changed the bodies of its inhabitants faster than streets could be widened. All of this is fascinating. None of it is healthy. Because what does a floating city do to a society? Let us answer properly and in detail. First, it changes class from abstraction to environment. In a ground city, wealth may buy larger rooms, better streets, cleaner water, stronger guards, proximity to rulers. In Netheril, sufficient magical and political power brought different ontological conditions. Better air, better view, different laws, continuous access to Mythala range, greater density of quasi-magical convenience, less exposure to mud, caravan delay, flood, crop failure, peasant complaint, and the ordinary humiliations by which grounded societies remember their dependence. Status ceased to be merely vertical in the figurative sense. It became aerial. Second, it changes property and urban value. A mythallar's range mattered. Quasi-magical items functioned within it. This means location within a city was not just fashionable, safe, or scenic. It was operational. Districts closest to arcane reliability became more desirable. Larger enclaves needed multiple mythallars. Entire patterns of construction, public service, and private luxury thus bent around magical radius. A house on an enclave was not just a house. It was a claim upon continuous ambient power. To live there was to inhabit a serviced field of magic, much as later cities might boast access to aqueduct, harbour, or defended walls. Arcane utility became a property market. Third, it changes labour by disguising dependence. This point is crucial because foolish admirers of Netheril often speak as though floating cities made the realm self-sufficient, a paradise of pure, wizardly independence. Nonsense. Enclaves still needed stone, timber, food, metals, textiles, labor, record-keeping, ship traffic, trade hubs, frontier outposts, and all the dull continuity of supply by which civilizations remain alive. Harbourage thrived as a major port because cargo still moved. Ascor mattered because dwarven trade still mattered. Lumber still came from forests, ore still came from mines, fish still came from water. What the Enclave changed was not dependence itself, but who had to feel it directly. Ground cities, outposts, caravan routes, and extractive ventures absorbed much of the friction. The archwizard above enjoyed the convenience. The countryside performed the argument. Floating cities do not abolish materiality. They push its inconvenience downward. Fourth, they change law. Every archwizard who raised an enclave also raised a jurisdiction. Not a legal district in the modest sense, a floating sovereignty. The sources make plain that each enclave established its own laws and guidelines. At first, perhaps, this variety could be narrated as innovation. In practice, it meant the further feudalization of arcane prestige into personal domains. Citizens did not merely belong to Netheril in the broad sense. They lived under the civic temperament of an individual archwizard. One ruler preferred scholarly prestige, another central planning, another military staging, another spectacle, another secrecy, another whim. Once people began leaving ground settlements for enclosures of magical comfort in the sky, their relationship to public law became more personal and more precarious. And as time went on, the ordinary people had less say. The sources are blunt on this as well. The enclaves became vehicles for funding the archwizard's research, staging campaigns against one another, and pursuing ever more ambitious ventures into plains and frontiers. Taxation, governance, and daily administration bent towards sustaining archwizard priorities. Civic life became an instrument for elite arcana. Again, one sees the pattern. Infrastructure first appears as abundance, then reveals itself as control. Fifth, floating cities change military thinking. Not only because they are hard to besiege, though that alone is enormous, they change what counts as strategic depth. An enclave can reposition, it can overfly terrain, it can threaten without committing infantry in the old way. It can serve as fortress, base, symbol, and mobile depot. In some cases, it need not even conquer a region conventionally. Its mere existence overhead alters bargaining. The same realm that once used magical gates to exterminate orc opposition now possessed mountains in the air, each capable of becoming a staging platform for campaigns, for coercive visits, for displays of force aimed as much at subject imagination as at enemy armor. Sixth, and perhaps most corrosive, they alter cultural humility. When a society wakes beneath impossible engineering every day, impossibility ceases to produce reverence and begins producing entitlement. Netheril's pride did not spring from nowhere. It was trained. The Mythala worked, the city floated, the room lights turned on, the water ran indoors. Force walls prevented foolish citizens from hurling themselves into the clouds. Colleges multiplied, arcanists invented, trades adapted, neighbors marveled or resented from below. What lesson was the average prosperous Netherese meant to draw from all this, except that their civilization had, in some meaningful sense, solved reality better than others? You may say, but had they not? Precisely. That is why the lesson was so dangerous. False pride can be corrected by failure. True partial success is much harder to survive. Seventh, the Enclave changes neighborly relations throughout Faerûn. The dwarves of Delzun loved trade and useful devices, but even warm relations with Netheril were relations with a culture increasingly shaped by magical excess. The elves, particularly those who already distrusted human haste, found Netheril's habits alarming. One source notes the unease elves felt in or beneath floating cities, and even the suppression of some of their innate resistances when directly under an enclave's influence. Whether you read that as environmental side effect, symbolic commentary written into the setting, or both, the point stands. Netheril's magical urbanism was not neutral to others. It imposed presence. It made the sky a medium of cultural pressure. Eighth, floating cities change the psychology of aspiration itself. Once enclaves existed, arcanist ambition acquired a new benchmark. Greatness no longer meant only mastering high spells, founding schools, or advising rulers. To become an archwizard in the fullest civic sense, one had to create a mythalar, shear a mountaintop, hire builders and architects, craft a unique environment, and lure citizens into a city that announced one's style of power to all Netheril. Magnitude became credential. Architecture became exam. Society itself became the archwizard's capstone project. Do you see how horrifyingly elegant that is? In many realms, ambitious mages seek towers. In Netheril, they sought municipalities. Thus the Enclave becomes the defining instrument of Netheril's magocracy because it answers every vanity at once. It is useful, it is visible, it is profitable, it is defensible, it attracts talent, it generates law, it embodies power, it distinguishes its creator from rivals, and it can be narrated as public good while functioning as personal sovereignty. No human civilization should have loved such a machine as much as Netheril did. Naturally, Netheril loved it immediately. The first floating city was followed by others, then others again. The realm entered periods later described as Silver Age and Golden Age, not because ethics improved, but because magical magnificence and civic extravagance multiplied. By the height of its power, Netheril had dozens of enclaves drifting the skies or following patterns above the loosely bounded realm. Some hovered nearly in place, some moved seasonally, some chose routes defined by weather, resources, or arch-wizard whim. One enclave per year, later summaries say, of the most fevered period. And while the arithmetic is less important than the impression is correct enough. The sky filled. It takes time for a metaphor to become policy. Netheril managed it. High Netheril and Low Netheril were no longer just analytical conveniences for historians. They were lived realities. The high cities held archwizards, scholars, wealthy artisans, religious centers, and populations fortunate or useful enough to remain in the Mythala-fed air. The low cities remained bustling, necessary, and exposed. Ports like Harborage and Ascor-linked trade mattered enormously. Agricultural districts mattered. Mining settlements mattered. Frontier strongholds mattered. Yet the cultural center of prestige had moved above them. And when the center of prestige moves away from the conditions that support it, moral distortion soon follows. That distortion is nowhere clearer than in Netheril's language and attitude toward those not sharing their assent. The very term groundling, casual in the sources, reveals volumes. It does not always mean peasant or enemy. Sometimes it simply denotes those who live below. But language has a way of collecting sneers around convenience. Groundling becomes more than descriptive. It becomes civilizational shorthand for the people who still endure what the sky has escaped. Which leads us to the next question. If a floating city makes social hierarchy visible, what happens to the people who continue feeding the hierarchy from below? Netheril answered that with brilliance, contempt, dependence, and a very human refusal to call dependence by its name. Daily life in Netheril is worth lingering over because this is precisely where lesser summaries fail. They give you the arch-wizards, they give you the scrolls, the mythalars, the final disaster, perhaps a dramatic painting of a city falling in theatrical self-importance. They do not ask what it felt like to buy bread, light a room, apprentice a child, pay rent, complain about a neighbor, haul cargo, study law, fear taxes, or raise a family under a civilization where magic had become so common that only its absence felt remarkable. That omission is understandable. Daily life rarely leaves behind monuments of adequate vanity. Still, we can reconstruct enough. Take the common household on an enclave during the mature ages of Netheril. Perhaps not luxurious by arch-wizard standards, but respectable. There are room lights, water flows indoors, small quasi-magical conveniences aid cooking, cleaning, storage, and climate control, depending on neighborhood and prosperity. Minor cantras are simply part of competence. Parents teach children the first habits of safe spell use long before true specialization enters the question. Workplaces assume some magical literacy. If a room light fails, it is an inconvenience, not a revelation. If a pipe from elemental water misbehaves, one curses the installer and calls for maintenance, not a priest for awe. This is what I mean when I say Netheril made magic infrastructural. Wonder did not vanish. It stratified. The great acts remained wondrous, but the lesser acts, The ambient acts, the useful acts, they became ordinary enough to shape expectation without demanding ceremony. Such societies grow subtle dependencies. They stop teaching certain forms of patience because those forms are no longer rewarded. Darkness becomes an outage rather than a nightly condition. Water shortage becomes a management failure rather than a hazard of place. Cooling, heating, preservation, transportation, communication, once enough of these are handled by magical supports, the citizen no longer experiences them as privileges, but as the neutral background of civilized life. He will complain if taxed to maintain them, and panic if deprived of them. He will also forget with unnerving speed how recently his ancestors lived otherwise. It is difficult not to hear modernity breathing in that. The middle class of Netheril, insofar as the category usefully applies, expanded through this logic. Lower-ranking arcanists sought the magical invention that might let them retire. Merchants sold gadgets meant to pass from novelty into necessity. City services grew around Mithila-fed function. Schools, universities, and trade instruction multiplied. One archwizard built networks of colleges and theatres because knowledge itself had become civic capital. Another gathered the best architects so that buildings could advertise both social prestige and anti-gravitational confidence. A floating city could lure citizens not merely by safety or patronage, but by style. The result was a culture in which aesthetics, utility, and status were inseparable. A door was not only a door if it could answer to command. A street was not only a street if its safety depended on force walls and levitation protocols. A college was not only a college if its very arrangement proclaimed that under the right patron, physics had become advisory. Thus, Netherese urbanism became pedagogical. It taught citizens whom to admire and what to consider civilized. Consider Karsus's enclave, where some structures defied customary orientation so thoroughly that people might move in localized weightlessness, traverse weird angles, or work amid architecture designed to impress the mind into consent. Consider Delia, shaped into concentric circles with the arch-wizard at center and commoners outward, not as accidental growth, but as a literal map of social theory. Consider the Temple of All Mysteries on Eulam's enclave, a singular admission that even a floating magocracy needed somewhere to address the source of its favored medium. Consider Harborage, where Mythala-powered devices made a port city into an advanced logistical node. Consider specialized enclaves devoted to mining, fish capture, scholarship, law, or even fraud. Every one of these is a policy statement disguised as city planning. Even the educational system reflects it. Because basic cantras were common, higher magical training could presume a prepared population. The gifted did not emerge from a wholly unlettered base. They emerged from a society already convinced that the weave was public fact. This matters. In many lands, the mage must first persuade others that magic matters. In Netheril, he is born into a world where it already does. His task is not justification, but escalation. You can feel the consequences in the attitude of arcanists toward priests. Netherese priests still existed, and their role in mediating divine winds remained respected in certain sectors. Yet many arcanists treated the gods with a hauteur one scarcely sees so nakedly elsewhere. Some source traditions note that accepting divine healing was viewed by certain arcanists as compromising one's chance at eventual godhood, or at least lowering one's dignity before powers they already half regarded as comparable beings. Think of that. A society in which even treatment of bodily injury could become entangled with elite, magical self-conception. Once human beings start seeing divinity as a rival profession rather than a category of the sacred, you are already standing on the threshold of a theological incident. We shall visit that threshold fully next episode. For now, note only that Netheril's confidence was not restricted to spell mechanics. It touched anthropology, religion, and racial judgment as well. This is where the dream of paradise rots. Because Netheril's diffusion of magic did not produce equality, it produced a sophisticated hierarchy with broader magical participation. Those are not the same thing. Teaching everyone cantras does not dissolve class. It only ensures that class speaks a more glamorous dialect. The source material is unsparing once one stops letting its voice smooth over the implications. Half-elves were often permitted in Netherese society only ambiguously, admired for useful magical talent, yet viewed as tainted humans who belonged fully to neither inheritance. They were often pushed into lower districts, paid less, and kept away from more elite areas. Halflings likewise found themselves treated as lower-class citizenry and segregated. Their own later memory of Netheril was not one of inclusion, but of second-class life in a realm too pleased with itself to notice that convenience had not made it kinder. Gnomes suffered worse. Early Netheril treated gnomes as useful slaves for generations. Let that stand plainly. The people who filled their homes with light and water and considered themselves the summit of human civilization also kept gnomes in bondage, later driving enough of them into escape and hidden refuge that old trails of flight entered regional memory. Again, the lesson is not novel, only perennial. A technologically or magically advanced society does not become morally advanced by mechanism. It acquires better ways to ignore contradiction. Netheril ignored contradiction with particular style. It admired dwarves more than most non-human peoples, largely because trade with Delzoun was profitable and because dwarven stonework, metal and practicality could be respected from a safe altitude. Elves inspired a mixture of irritation, gratitude, rivalry, and the unspoken need to outdo one's teachers. Less magically developed human peoples, the Rengarth, Angard, and many Western tribes, were often viewed with snobbery, at times as embarrassing cousins, at times as potential auxiliaries, and at times as peoples to be reshaped or bypassed. One of the wiser Netherese voices, the Chronomancer, worried openly that such contempt for less magically developed neighbors would come back to haunt the Empire. He was right, though not right enough. The pattern deserves emphasis. Netheril was not cruel because it used magic. It was cruel in many of the familiar human ways and used magic to make those arrangements more comfortable for the powerful. Infrastructure softened inconvenience without correcting appetite. Indeed, it often intensified appetite by proving that large systems could be made to work. What of work itself in such a society? Here again, the image of idle skylords floating through endless luxury must be corrected. Netheril's comforts required immense labor. Builders, masons, carpenters, scribes, dockhands, traders, teachers, servants, miners, fishers, teamsters, herders, artisans, city guards, legal officials, and workshop staffs all remained necessary. The archwizard could suspend his city above the ground. He could not eat a concept. Someone still planted grain. Someone still shaped marble. Someone still cleaned the chambers in which scholars debated whether reality had any right to remain stubborn. And because the enclave's increased demand for specialized materials, transport, and maintenance, the labor of the non-glorious often became more intense, not less. A floating city, after all, is not simpler than a ground city. It is a ground city with delusions and additional engineering. Every magical convenience has to be installed, monitored, repaired, paid for, and socially distributed. Every law written by an archwizard still descends through officials, constables, and clerks. Every quasi-magical item sold to make life easier has to be manufactured, advertised, exchanged, and regulated. A myth-Allah-powered society is therefore not an escape from administration. It is administration made more arcane, more dependent on specialist knowledge, and more expensive to challenge. That last point is politically decisive. In a conventional city, a corrupt aristocrat may be hated for taxes, guards, property rights, or judicial favoritism. In Netheril, a citizen might also depend on the magical regime itself for light, comfort, water, transport, and access to the status of living in a functioning enclave. Resistance becomes psychologically harder when the system does not merely command you, but supplies your conveniences. One resents the ruler, perhaps, but one also fears disruption. Such fears produce obedience even before soldiers arrive. This is why paradise is often such an efficient disguise for control. If a realm gives you enough comfort, you will tolerate a shocking amount of altitude. The ground settlements complicate the picture further. Not everyone lived in the sky. Many never would. There were thriving ground cities that interacted with enclaves constantly and pragmatically. Harbourage, for example, became one of the most advanced ports in Netheril precisely because its Mythala-supported works improved cargo handling and storage. It mattered because ships still mattered. Even flying cities were too cumbersome or too specialized to replace every port, every market, every regional exchange. Some enclaves traveled to gather resources or display themselves. They did not abolish the need for hubs below. And so a two-level civilization persisted. Dazzling airborne prestige above, indispensable terrestrial functionality below. This produced not merely inequality, but differing experiences of citizenship. The citizen of High Netheril lived close to the archwizard, inside the Mythala field, amid concentrated arcane luxury and law. The citizen of Low Netheril might live in a prosperous trade city, a frontier outpost, a port, or a settlement servicing extraction and transport. He saw the same empire differently. Perhaps he admired the enclaves as proof of national greatness. Perhaps he despised them as hovering mouths. Perhaps he dreamed his children might ascend. Perhaps he concluded correctly that they would die loading stone for someone else's dream. All of these responses existed. History is never kind enough to choose only one. The frontier gives us another angle. As the enclaves multiplied, Netheril expanded westward and northward, establishing outposts, watering stations, and mineral ventures. The discovery of Chardalin later intensified this drive, as did interest in realm space and other frontiers. Here, the phrase magic as infrastructure reveals its full appetite. Once a civilization solves enough internal problems, it begins looking outward for new inputs. More mines, more forests, more resources, more magical discoveries, more routes. Floating cities, contrary to romantic nonsense, did not make Netheril contemplative. They made it expansionist, not always through annexation in the old marching army sense, though that remained available. Often through extraction, penetration, scouting, and the assumption that every nearby region existed partly as a future entry in some arch-wizard's ledger of opportunities. The chronologies of the Golden Age are full of exactly such ventures. New enclaves rising, new laws promulgated, new experiments conducted, new frontier settlements established, new contacts sought in far lands, below the sea, above the world, and across planar thresholds. Netheril's confidence bred curiosity. Curiosity, fed by Mythala-backed power, became entitlement. The realm did not merely look at the world and ask what it contained. It asked what of it could be integrated into the Netherese project. This is another way a floating city changes society. It makes mobility imperial. What might have been a caravan, a colony, or a scholarly expedition in another culture becomes, in Netheril, the extension of a magocratic lifestyle. A moving enclave is not just travel, it is civilization arriving pre-justified. It carries its light, water, law, and social hierarchy with it. It does not go abroad in uncertainty. It goes abroad as self-contained proof. No wonder so many neighbors found the Netherese insufferable. The Netherese, for their part, found themselves splendid. They had reasons. And that is what makes them worthy of careful fear rather than easy mockery. There is another consequence of the enclave system that deserves its own lamp and table. It turns political theory into biography. In a realm of many floating cities, each ruled by an arch-wizard whose style informs law, architecture, taxation, public culture, and acceptable risk, the question, what is Netheril, becomes harder to answer than later nostalgists admit. Netheril is not merely one empire, it is one empire whose upper tier has fragmented into a constellation of personal regimes orbiting shared language, shared arrogance, and shared mythalar technology. The center holds, but not with the serene impersonality that bureaucrats prefer. It holds because the arch-wizards all buy into the larger prestige economy of being Netherese, and because Iulaum's foundational systems gave them a common grammar. Within that grammar, however, personality matters enormously. This is why the concordances of Netheril are so useful. They are full of cities that read like arguments. Doubloon, the rogue enclave of counterfeiters and jewel traffic, demonstrates how quickly magical mobility could shelter criminal sovereignty. Joktaleg, where reckless manipulation of the mythalar transformed an entire population into giantkin, shows the cost of treating civic power sources as personal laboratories. Delia, originally shaped by druidic and elven hands before being fully assimilated into Netherese enclave life, shows how even idealistic or alternative beginnings were absorbed by the logic of airborne prestige. Karsus's enclave, later remembered as Ailianar in some traditions, shows what happens when architecture itself becomes propaganda for one man's mind. Uleum's own enclave stands as a sort of patriarchal standard, half school, half capital, half perpetual reminder that I am counting badly because one cannot fit Netheril's excess into sober fractions. Each enclave taught by example. Citizens migrated not merely to cities, but to interpretations of what magical civilization ought to feel like. One archwizard offered law and order, another spectacle, another scholarship, another opportunity for enrichment, another escape from life below, another access to patronage networks, another proximity to prestige. This sharpened competition among archwizards in ways that made every civic project susceptible to vanity. If your rival city has more wondrous architecture, larger colleges, better districts, more alluring taxes, or more reliable magical luxuries, your problem is no longer personal envy alone. It is municipal weakness. The city becomes the ego's external organ. From there, the escalation rights itself. Carsus hired famous architects because magical power alone did not initially attract enough citizens to his youth-built enclave. So he turned image into recruitment. Buildings defied gravity and ordinary orientation. Universities and colleges multiplied. Status accumulated around attendance, work, and residence. A city became successful not only because it functioned, but because it staged success visibly enough to compel participation. This is deeply Netheril's. Grandeur must not merely exist, it must attract. Yet even this is not the deepest alteration. The deepest alteration is temporal. A floating city changes what a society thinks progress looks like. Most cultures measure advancement by security, continuity, fertility, expansion, beauty, piety, justice, or durable memory. Netheril increasingly measured it by magical throughput. More devices, more services, more new spells, more powerful archwizards, more spectacular urban forms, more exploration, more discoveries, more refined control. Advancement ceased to mean simply that children were fed and borders secure. It meant that the empire was moving farther into possibility. This gives a society tremendous momentum. It also makes moderation resemble decline. Notice how many Netheril's problems follow from that single cultural shift. If magical consumer goods enrich life, why should there not be more of them? If mythalars can power one enclave, why not larger ones, or multiple in a single city? If room lights and water are good, why should gravity itself not be reimagined for elegance and play? If cities float, why not explore the skies beyond Toril? If ores and magical stones remain in distant lands, why should enclaves not expand and colonize them? If the Nether Scrolls contain depth still unmastered, why should any archwizard stop digging? If the gods are beings of power rather than inviolate mystery, why should sufficiently advanced mages not one day rival them openly? You see the structure. The success of infrastructure becomes an argument against restraint. In such an environment, even warnings are reinterpreted as failures of nerve. An enclave falls because one experiment went wrong. Then the answer is better technique, not less ambition. A city goes rogue into criminality. Then the answer is stronger surveillance and more effective arch-wizardal force, not a reconsideration of why cities can become airborne fiefdoms. Elves complain that magic is being treated carelessly. Then the answer is to demonstrate superior results. Barbarians resent the sky cities. Then they should have learned faster, traded better, or stayed out of the way. One can hear these rationalizations forming centuries before Karsus ever opens his mouth. This is why the comparison between Iulaum and Karsus matters so much. It is not merely a comparison of two powerful men. It is a comparison of two philosophies that were both plausible inside Netheril, both admired there and both disastrous in different proportions. Let us start with Iulaum. Iulaum, as I have said, is system. He trains thousands, he builds the Mythalar, he raises the first enclave, he allows, uniquely, a temple of Mistral upon his city. He fights wars not merely by individual might, but by organizing movement and force. He helps produce a world in which other archwizards can exist meaningfully. He is paternal without being gentle, visionary without being modest, expansive without confusing every idea with his own soul. Even his later reclusiveness in researching deeper magical threats still fits the pattern. The great architect trying to understand larger conditions before the house collapses. Iulaum asks, in essence, how magic can uphold civilization. Do not mishear that as benevolence. Civilizations uphold many ugly things. What matters is the scale of concern. His focus is societal, training pipelines, shared devices, strategic campaigns, enduring systems. Even his own enclave, for all its prestige, functions as a center from which others are educated, spun off, supported, or influenced. When population pressure increases, citizens can be moved to aid new enclaves. When scholarship grows, institutions grow with it. When devotion to Mistral swells, the temple is enlarged again and again. This is a builder's mind. A dangerous builder, yes. Still a builder. Karsus is something else. From childhood he is drawn as prodigy. He casts a cantrip instinctively at the age of 2. The priesthood of Mistral takes interest. He learns rapidly, almost inherently, and from the beginning there is in him not merely brilliance, but scale hunger. The sources say it with unusual frankness. He believed himself worthy of a god's stature. That is not the ordinary vanity of an intelligent youth. It is the seed of a worldview. Karsus does not ask first how magic serves civilization. He asks what level of being ought properly correspond to his own gifts. If Iulaum builds systems, Karsus builds proofs. Proof that he is greater than rivals. Proof that architecture can carry his image. Proof that laws may conform to his will. Proof that the remaining depths of the Nether Scrolls ought pass through his hands. Proof that rawer, denser, more dangerous forms of magic can and should be compelled into use. Iulaum thinks in terms of sustaining a magical society. Karsus thinks in terms of becoming the apex expression of what such a society has licensed itself to admire. That difference is everything. Now, because history enjoys cruelty, Netheril admired both impulses. It admired the father and the prodigy. It admired institution and spectacle. It admired the teacher who made civic arcana possible, and the young genius who seemed to promise a still more dazzling tomorrow. Why would it not? This was a culture trained to equate magical advancement with civilizational health. Karsus looked like advancement in human form. He also looked beautiful to disaster. Karsus reached Archwizard status at the age of 22, the youngest ever to do so. And here we should note what that title required. One did not become an Archwizard simply by winning arguments, memorizing spells, or impressing a patron. One had to create a mythala, carve an enclave from a mountain, erect a city upon it, and claim it as one's own. In other words, one had to demonstrate not simply magical might, but civic authorship. Archwizardry in Netheril was not only intellectual rank, it was municipal sovereignty earned through engineering, planning, and social acquisition. For Ulium, that path was the extension of a civil project. For Karsus, it became a stage. His early difficulty in attracting businesses and residences because of his youth is one of those details I cherish. The realm had become so committed to magical magnificence that a 22-year-old could shear a mountain, raise a city, and still discover that ordinary citizens wanted some reassurance he was not an especially dangerous child. Their hesitation was sensible. His answer was Netherese. He made the city more impossible. He hired architects to defy physical law. He made structures that lured the ambitious by promise of status. He turned the enclave into a collection of colleges and wonders so visually compelling that citizens could be recruited by the fantasy of belonging to the future. There is, I confess, a dry magnificence in the maneuver. It is also a warning. Karsus understood that in Netheril, image was infrastructural too. People do not move to a floating city only because it functions. They move because it represents a life they have been taught to desire. His city demonstrated the mature Netherese synthesis of consumer splendor and authoritarian personalization. One mythala powered common quasi-magical items. Another helped sustain more extravagant luxuries and gravity-defying architecture. Force walls prevented people from tumbling over the sides. Weightless movement itself became a feature of civic experience. Colleges flourished, status clustered. The Archwizard's preferences were law, and because Karsus's magical prominence rose so quickly, his local law began pressuring wider Netherese custom. What he wanted in his city increasingly affected what others thought acceptable in the realm. This is how prodigy becomes policy. And Karsus's law, where the surviving material permits a glance, is revealing. Research theft could merit death by magic. Punishments were harsh, theatrical, and designed to defend not some broad concept of public justice, but the sanctity of magical hierarchy. Non-human life in those laws fares poorly. Political violence and magical coercion braid together. The city becomes safe, yes, in the way a sheathed dagger is safe, orderly because everyone knows exactly what lies at the hilt. Karsus is often remembered only for the final act to come, which is understandable and lazy. But the better study is in the years before the catastrophe, because there you can watch Netheril teaching itself that his type of greatness is admirable. Citizens flocked to his colleges. Architects worked wonders in his service. Other archwizards envied and resented him. The remaining nether scrolls would later be loaned to him for study in hope that he might synthesize their missing relationships. Why? Because he was effective. Because his magical might genuinely exceeded Eolaum's in some respects. Because he seemed the answer to a civilization trained always to want the next escalation. That is how overreach becomes collective, not one man having a bad afternoon. a whole society becoming unable to distinguish brilliance from entitlement until the two are mutually reinforcing. The contrast with Eolam sharpens further in the realm of self-limitation. Eolam was ruthless, certainly. He exterminated enemies. He built systems of staggering consequence. He enjoyed prestige without apology. Yet the tradition surrounding him consistently preserves discipline as one of his defining traits. He trained others. He expanded thoughtfully. He remained privately concerned by Karsus's impatience. He turned more reclusive when confronting deeper magical threats and abandoned at least one more complex Mythala project rather than force it to completion without proper confidence. Whatever else may be said of him, he understood that scale requires management. Karsus understood scale as appetite. His later researches into condensed arcane force, what some traditions call heavy magic, power so concentrated it behaved almost like a substance, show the same tendency. To Karsus, magic was not only something to distribute or elegantly civilize, it was something to intensify, isolate, and master in ever rawer forms. Such research produced astonishing effects and hideous collateral damage. It is a signpost toward the next episode, but it belongs here because it reveals the philosophical split already underway. Eolam built the grid. Karsus wanted the sun behind it. If Eolam asked, "How can a civilization live within grand magic?" Karsus asked, "What should grand magic submit to, if not me?" Netheril needed both questions only insofar as it wished to die spectacularly. Yet one must admit that Karsus was not simply a madman tolerated by fools. He emerged naturally from the values Netheril had cultivated. Merit measured in magical innovation, status measured in civic wonder, competition among archwizards, social approval for escalating comfort and spectacle, confidence that gods were not qualitatively beyond comparison, faith that better technique could solve every prior problem, a floating city as proof of maturity, a mythalar as utility source. The constant message that reality yielded to disciplined will. Given all that, Karsus is not an aberration. He is the logic of the culture walking upright and dressed in genius. Eolam too is of the culture, but he is its organizing intelligence, its builder, its patient centralizer. Karsus is its acceleration, its appetite made glamorous, its future tense. And that is why episode 15 cannot simply celebrate Netheril's wonders and postpone Karsus until the fall. He belongs to the rise because he grows directly out of the values the rise enthrones. The enclave culture that seems so dazzling at first already contains him. Every room light, every water closet, every college built in open defiance of gravity, every child taught that cantras are ordinary, every citizen impressed by airborne law rather than alarmed by it. All these form the background against which Karsus can look inevitable. A civilization does not collapse only because one man goes too far. It collapses because many people were rewarded for a very long time for deciding that too far is merely another way of saying not yet fully attempted. Once the enclave became normative, Netheril entered the phase all triumphant systems eventually reach. Expansion no longer felt like policy. It felt like metabolism. This is the period later remembered as the Silver Age, the Golden Age, and the Age of Discovery. The names flatter naturally. Victorious cultures always title their excess in precious metals. Yet the names are not wholly undeserved if one is describing capability rather than wisdom. Netheril truly was at the height of its power. Enclaves multiplied, trade thickened, outposts spread west. Magical consumer goods proliferated, mining expanded. The skies filled with stone citadels riding air currents or tracing patterned routes over the empire. In some years, it seemed a new enclave rose almost by habit, as though mountains had become seedlings. What happens to a society when triumph lasts long enough to feel procedural? It stops interpreting warning signs as warnings. Netheril's Age of Discovery is therefore not merely a catalogue of wonders. It is the period in which infrastructural success begins mutating into civilizational compulsion. When miners discovered Chardalin, those curious arcane gems able to store spells, the Empire did not admire them and move on. It launched itself into an expedition frenzy. Archwizards poured wealth into prospecting, mining, and the search for ever more useful deposits. Mountains became ledgers, wilderness became possibility awaiting survey. The known world was not enough. It had to be searched for inputs compatible with a magical economy already too hungry to be satisfied by its own accomplishments. This is why I insist on using the language of infrastructure rather than simple wonder. A wondrous culture may appreciate marvels. An infrastructural culture needs supply chains. Soon enough, even realm space drew Netheril's attention. Spell-jamming ventures, particularly those associated with enclaves such as Yeoman's Loft, sought ores, magical objects, and further discoveries beyond Toril. There is a dreadful predictability to this. Once a society has made gravity negotiable at home, the heavens begin to look less like mystery and more like underexploited territory. Of course, the Netheris went upward. Of course, they imagined the next frontier in terms of raw materials, arcane opportunities, and the extension of prestige. Of course, some among them took to vile experimentation upon whatever they encountered, thereby gifting Netheril's travelers a reputation in space only slightly less beloved than Illithid's. A civilization that can no longer distinguish curiosity from entitlement is always shocked when the wider cosmos dislikes its manners. Netheril was not an exception. This outward push had internal effects as well. As more resources were directed toward exploration, extraction, and spectacle, the enclaves became not merely residences of the elite, but engines requiring constant inputs. Mining districts swelled, frontier violence increased, ground settlements were drawn deeper into the support matrix. Some archwizards cared about the strain. Most cared insofar as strain threatened output. The chronomancer, in one of the more lucid traditions preserved from the time, worried that Netheril's snobbery toward less magically developed peoples would return to haunt the empire. He also seems to have felt genuine concern for neighboring races and peoples, even while sharing many of Netheril's assumptions about the gods as challengeable powers. Such figures existed. They mattered. They did not prevail. Because infrastructure teaches a cruel lesson about success. The better the system works, the easier it becomes to dismiss its critics as romantics, provincials, or the envious. Meanwhile, the enclaves themselves provided ample evidence that success was not the same as safety. One of the earliest floating cities, Sunrest, fell from the sky after a spell research failure. That should have terrified the Empire into a slower pace. It did not. Joktaleg's Mythalar experiments transformed its entire population into giant forms. That should have prompted a more severe doctrine of civic magical restraint. It did not. Doubloon became a rogue enclave associated with counterfeiting and evasive lawlessness. That should have inspired deep reconsideration of what it meant to let flying municipalities become private ambitions. It did not. Karsus's own enclave developed harsh internal legal structures and a politics of overawing splendor. Citizens and rivals alike treated this more as a statement of his prominence than as a flashing civic ailment. One city after another demonstrated that when arch-wizard ego, Mythalar dependence, and airborne sovereignty combined, the results could be unstable, coercive, or absurd. Still, Netheril floated on. I do not say this merely to condemn. There is a larger lesson here. Human societies are extraordinarily capable of localizing disaster. One city falls. It was a regrettable singularity. One experiment transforms a populace, a technical anomaly. One rogue enclave embarrasses the state, a policing problem. One frontier expedition gains the Empire a foul name among spacerfolk, an issue of diplomacy. None of these individually seems enough to indict the whole dream. And because each problem occurs within a civilization whose general material conditions remain impressive, the average prosperous citizen concludes that the system still works. This is why long declines are so hard to narrate honestly. People living inside them continue buying bread. The Shadowed Age, however, brought troubles harder to localize. Later tradition marks its beginning with Karsus's birth and its end with his final spell. But the important feature for us is atmosphere. Doom does not yet reign openly. Rather, shadows lengthen around a society too successful to believe fully in its own vulnerability. Deeper magic is discovered. More dangerous experiments are pursued. The plane of shadow receives increasing attention from minds entirely too confident in their ability to treat all realities as research provinces. Karsus grows, Iulaum grows more reclusive. The enchantment of possibility, far from fading, intensifies. And then the land itself begins to answer. The Faerûn enter the story not merely as monsters to fight, but as a corrective to Netheril's assumptions. They were ancient, malign, and devastatingly well-suited to attacking the hidden premise of the Empire. Netheril depended on life-rich land below and magical abundance above. The Faerûn answered by draining life, blighting territory, and corrupting the very ecological basis of the Empire's support structure. One can almost admire the precision if one has a sufficiently cruel temperament. The Sky Cities had declared a form of independence from the ground while still feeding upon it. The Faerûn made the ground sick. This mattered most to Low Netheril first. Always remember that. The arch-wizards in the clouds might investigate, debate, scry, theorize, or dismiss. The villages, outposts, fields, and trade routes below began experiencing the consequences materially. Crops failed, waters diminished. The beginnings of the great desertification that would later define Anarok crept into the realm not as dramatic apocalypse, but as spreading attrition. Support bases weakened, people moved, frontier confidence faltered. The old relationship between High and Low Netheril, already imbalanced, became crueler as the high depended ever more on a low that could no longer bear the same weight. And what does a society built on magical convenience do when its support structure begins to fail? It looks upward for a new solution. Karsus's age was made for such a moment. Before we arrive at him fully, however, notice what happened to Iulaum. The old father of the empire did not become a triumphant elder, calmly presiding over a stable machine. He grew reclusive. He investigated the strange magic emanating from far below. He began working on more complex Mythala research and later abandoned at least one such effort. Sources hint that he learned something significant about the Faerûn's life drain and magic drain workings, but whatever he understood, he did not translate into a publicly stabilizing doctrine before his disappearance. Whether that failure was personal, political, or the simple result of confronting a problem larger than even his system builder's genius could quickly answer, the effect was the same. The civilization lost its greatest architect just as its operating assumptions required the steadiest hand. An empire that had grown used to a paternal center now had a vacuum. It had, unfortunately, Karsus nearby. This is where the remaining nether scrolls re-enter the drama with a certain dreadful symmetry. Half had been stolen long before and never recovered. The surviving set, treasured and protected, was ultimately loaned into Karsus's orbit in the hope that his prodigious capacity might uncover relationships and missing structures within their lore. This decision always reads to me like a civilization confessing its addiction to escalation. Faced with growing crisis, it reached not for simplification, not for retrenchment, not for shared sacrifice, but for deeper study by its brightest and least patient genius. One can hear the meetings now. We need a solution proportionate to the threat. Meaning, of course, something larger than wisdom. The late Shadowed Age is therefore the perfect setup to the fall because it reveals the full problem with magic as infrastructure. Infrastructure centralizes expectation. Citizens assume supply, protection, utility, and continuity. When those begin to wobble, the political pressure to restore them at scale becomes immense. If your lights go dark because the city has failed, you do not long for moral philosophy. You long for power restored. If the land below withers and your airborne grandeur depends upon it, you do not necessarily question the grandeur first. You seek a greater spell, a better device, a stronger hand, a master solution. Netheril, having trained itself for centuries to trust large magical answers, could scarcely imagine another kind. This is why I do not narrate Karsus as a mere aberrant ego. He was the civilization's emergency fantasy given a body, brilliant enough to believe, admired enough to be empowered, proud enough to attempt what caution would dismiss. In another society, perhaps, such a man becomes an isolated terror or a splendid exile. In Netheril, he became plausible policy. The Empire's previous successes had prepared the moral terrain. If Mythalas could make cities float, why should a still greater working not solve the Faerûn threat? If archwizards had repeatedly surpassed old limits, why imagine this time to be different? If the gods themselves had long been conceptualized as powers rather than mysteries, why should the realm's greatest mind not approach them as problems of scale? If every prior warning had been addressed by more magic, Why should the final warning require less? Observe the trap. Every correctable problem in a triumphant age teaches the society that all problems are correctable by the same class of means. Then comes one that is not, or not at the scale, speed, and arrogance desired. One can trace the emotional climate of Netheril's last rise from the records of its cities. Riots in some enclaves, population movements, rebuilding efforts, cities drifting for resource reasons or to escape worsening conditions, faith fraying in some quarters, intensifying in others, scholars pressing deeper into strange magical disciplines, ground settlements enduring attacks, scarcity or abandonment. The sky still magnificent, which is perhaps the cruelest detail. Catastrophe often ripens under an unreasonably beautiful sky. And still the daily comforts mattered. The lights, the water, the schools, the force walls, the laws, the colleges, the market for quasi-magical devices, the assumption that one belonged to the most advanced human civilization in the world. Such things do not vanish the moment danger appears. They continue, even become more cherished, making people more desperate to preserve the whole arrangement. Dependency on the system intensifies loyalty to dangerous fixes. This is the deep answer to the episode's core question. What does magic as infrastructure do to a society? It gives it astonishing capability. It gives it splendor. It gives it forms of comfort, efficiency, and aspiration no ordinary realm can match. And if that magic is deeply integrated enough, it also makes the society vulnerable to believing that every structural crisis can and must be met by larger structural magic. By the eve of the fall, Netheril had become exactly such a society. A child in the early ages learned cantras at 13 and discovered that the world was touchable. A householder in the Mithala age learned that light and water could be made ambient. A citizen of the Enclave age learned that law and status could rise into the sky. A prosperous Netherese of the late Empire learned that comfort, civic identity, and magical scale were inseparable. And when the shadows lengthened, all of them together learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that because magic had built their civilization, only greater magic could save it. Next time we will watch what happened when Karsus agreed. So before we close the folio tonight, let me leave you with the questions Netheril still refuses to answer politely. When a civilization teaches every child to touch the weave, is that democratization of wonder, or the first step in making transcendence feel like public utility? At what point does familiarity with magic cease to enlarge humility and begin instead to breed impatience with any limit that cannot be negotiated, purchased, or engineered away? What, in your judgment, was the true turning point in Netheril's rise? The discovery of the Nether Scrolls, the decision to teach cantras broadly, the invention of the Mithala, or the first moment a city rose into the air and the people below realized that class had acquired altitude? Which of those made the fall, still centuries distant, newly possible? And what of Eulam and Karsus? Which philosophy is truly more dangerous? The patient builder who creates systems so powerful that a civilization reorganizes itself around them, or the prodigy who inherits those systems and asks what ultimate act they now make thinkable. Is overreach more often born from reckless youth, or from the stable successes that taught youth to trust overreach in the first place? Finally, consider the floating city itself. Is it a triumph of imagination, a machine of class, a mobile fortress, a civic miracle, an archwizard's vanity made habitable, or all of these at once? When a people place their homes above the land that feeds them, have they transcended dependence or merely hidden it from the comfortable? Sit with those for a while. The air above old empires is never empty. It is full of assumptions. Next time we continue with Netheril, but not its ascent. We descend with it. We will come to the year of sundered webs, to Karsus's folly, to the death of Mistral and the birth of Mistra, to the moment the weave itself is wounded badly enough that later ages learn to fear certain heights of spellcraft. We will speak of why magic after Netheril becomes more regulated, why archmages thereafter inherit suspicion alongside awe, and why the broken bones of fallen enclaves still serve as nearly inexhaustible fuel for adventurers, tyrants, and dungeon masters, with a healthy respect for cautionary architecture. That, however, is for our next descent. For tonight, remember that taleofthelich.com is live. The timelines are gathering there, the transcripts are gathering there. The connective tissue between these episodes is gathering there as well, because no age in Faerûn stands alone for long, and Netheril least of all. If tonight's journey through mythalars, enclaves, and the civic domestication of wonder has left you wanting maps, sequence, and a clearer view of where the sky first became policy, go to taleofthelich.com. Merch is coming soon too, because the present age remains determined to prove that no grave meditation on hubris is complete until someone can wear it to market. I confess I am still adjusting to the idea. Yet I concede there are worse conversational openings than a shirt that prompts some passerby to ask, why precisely should one distrust a floating city? This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you need a website built cleanly, systems shaped with foresight, or technical work done by people who understand that maintenance is not beneath genius, but one of its tests, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. And if the tale served you tonight, leave a rating or review. The modern world excels at burying careful memory under louder and emptier things. Every act of support helps keep these old continuities lit a little longer. Until next time, my apprentice, shut the cabinet softly. Do not mistake convenience for wisdom. Do not trust a city merely because it has risen. And if ever you stand beneath some relic of Netheril and feel for one reckless instant that a sufficiently gifted will ought to be obeyed because it has made the impossible look routine, step back and ask what other routines that will has already taught a people to accept. Civilizations seldom fall at the first miracle. They fall after the miracle has become ordinary. Good night. May your lights remain useful but never sovereign. Your learning exceed your pride. Your thresholds remember the ground, and your judgment stay sharp against every power that calls dependence progress.